Oh my God, a worm. Bear with me. Okay, so oddly enough, this may come as a surprise to you, but your body is like a segmented worm. A segmented worm, you might have, let me erase everything. You might have dissected one of these, like I did in high school. It was pretty horrific. An earthworm has these basic segments, and each one is pretty much the same down the whole length of the worm. And each segment, you can see here, includes some basic parts. You've got a gut tube of some sort, you've got some sort of blood vessel, and you've got maybe a nerve cord down here. And that repeats over and over again down the length of the worm. And you may think, we are not segmented like that. We're nothing like a worm. That is incorrect. We are actually. The best piece of evidence that we have for that is actually a dermatomes, which I showed you back in chapter 16. These are like the areas which each spinal nerve covers. And actually, not just the dermatomes, but the spinal cord itself. You remember we talked about the various segments, like here's all the C segments, C2, 3, 4, 5, the thoracic, T1 through 12, lumbar and sacral. They're like a bunch of segments. It's just weird what happened in humans and some other vertebrates is that we just grew these weird limbs out the side. Otherwise, this area is like a segmented worm, the torso and the head. And yeah, you can see all these segments here. Typical body segment. So imagine that I didn't advance that slide forward. Okay, so we've got a single, it's not spectacular, but it'll do. This is like a cross section of the abdomen. Specifically, this would be a transverse where you divide the body into top and bottom halves. I'm going to draw in here. Hopefully you recognize what this is. That's a little vertebrae. And that vertebrae about marks the boundary here between. This is what we call the dorsal cavity. I think your book calls it the posterior aspect, which is silly because they go ahead and call this front part the ventral cavity. And to be consistent, ventral dorsal. I guess you could call this the anterior and the posterior cavity, but traditionally it's always been called dorsal and ventral. So when your little embryo is developing, the embryo is still kind of just a blob. It's actually kind of like a disc. It's like this flat disc. And early on, it doesn't have anything resembling what we think of as being a person yet. It will divide up into front and back halves, and these two cavities will form. So this is very, very basic development, front and back cavities. And it just so happens that the back cavity grows less, the dorsal cavity, than the front, the ventral. The ventral ends up growing much bigger. And it actually includes all the stuff that you think of as internal organs, and your limbs are all ventral cavity. Your limbs grow out of the ventral cavity like this. Okay, maybe not exactly like that, but somewhat. So, those are silly. The dorsal cavity is really primarily nervous system stuff, like the spinal cord, and your head actually is an outgrowth of the dorsal cavity. The ventral cavity has other things like circulatory, digestive, etc. So what happens when this thing is developing, this cavity, there's this membrane which lines the inside of it. You know what? I'm gonna do this in red. I think what I'm gonna do is torture you all by erasing the whole thing and starting over. Okay, so now I'm gonna draw a red body segment, and I'm gonna draw a vertebrae. And we have our dorsal and ventral cavities. I'm not gonna label. Draw kind of a dotted line because sort of imagine that line. There are muscles and things that indicate that border, but won't get into the details of that. Okay, so in the ventral cavity lining it, you have this membrane. It's just a sheet. And this membrane is called a serous membrane. Now, you don't have any organs yet. We're talking really early fetus. Okay, no organs yet. Then organs are going to start growing. And I'm going to be mad at myself because I'm going to delete the words I just wrote. Okay, that serous membrane as the organ grows, the organ will grow into it. So I'm going to draw an organ. Here we go. There's a heart, very sophisticated heart. And that heart is going to grow into that membrane like this. And it's going to keep growing in just like this. And it's going to keep growing until it fills in this whole cavity. And the membrane actually becomes a sac around it, a double layered sac. So the membrane is in fact continuous, but as it grows, these two parts of it will eventually touch each other, and those parts have names. This part, the layer that is closest to the organ, and this happens for a lot of organs, not just the heart, that's called the visceral layer. And then this layer right here that actually lines what we call the body wall, is the parietal layer. Actually, I want to label that body wall. So this line, this red line on the outside, call this body wall that holds everything in. That would include things like ribs, all your muscles like intercostal muscles, abdominal muscles. That's the body wall that holds everything in. So lining the inside of that wall of muscle and bone is the parietal layer, and then lining the organ is the visceral layer. And so eventually what you'll find, I'll draw one more for you. And this time it's a blue body segment. Okay, it's getting worse every time. I'll go ahead and draw. Okay, it really is getting worse. Okay, let's try that bird again. Whoop, there we go. Okay, and then I'm going to draw now. This will be a blue. Oop, actually, I don't want to do that. What I want to do the heart and the lungs. So you have your heart that grows in, and let's make the heart giant this time. Really, really giant. And then one big balloony lung over there, and another big balloony lung over there. The heart would relatively not be that big, but just bear with me. And then we have that lining, so let's do the parietal lining. And I wish I hadn't drawn the lung that close. And then, actually it does get this tight. These layers adhere to each other so tightly. And then we have these visceral layers around each organ, and then the parietal layer. So what you end up with is that the heart and the two lungs, they grew into three separate little places, infoldings in the serous membrane. So what you end up with is a sac around all three separate sacs that they grew into. So you can imagine, like, if there was one single balloon in the beginning like this, and then your lungs started to grow in here, your heart into there, and your other lung into there, you'd start getting these specific little chambers, and they just keep growing. So they each get their own sac. These serous membranes have specific names depending on what organ they're surrounding. And in the case of the heart, the serous membranes, actually, I'll tell you a couple different ones because I'll show you the lungs later. The serous membranes get special names depending what organ they're around. The heart, its serous membranes are called the pericardium around the heart. That's the sac around the heart. And in the lungs, it's called pleura. Same thing, they're all serous membranes. I'll just give you one more. In the digestive system, it gets a few special names, but for the most part, we call it peritoneum. I'm going to run out of letters, sorry. That's the end, peritoneum. They're all serous membranes, but they get specific names around different organs. Okay, so, woof, my God, what a mess. Okay, so this is your book's version. You have to go all the way back to chapter 10. Again, I don't do this in chapter 1, excuse me. I don't do it back then because you'll just forget if we do this like the first day of classes. Think of that embryonic organ growing into a balloon. Say you have a balloon that isn't blown up quite all the way. It's not tight enough. that you can't just push your fist into it. And as you push your fist into it, you can imagine that you'd have a layer of the balloon that's right up against your hand. And then you'd have this other layer on the outside. And that if the balloon was really not very inflated, you could eventually have those two layers touch. So that's what happened to each of these organs. And so the heart is, of course, what we'll focus on, but the heart grows into this sac that's called pericardium. And you have a parietal layer and a visceral layer right up against the heart. Oh, and I forgot to talk about this. Each of these serous membrane sacs around each of these organs, in between the parietal and the visceral layers, you have serous fluid. So that's true around the lungs, and this just is a mess. We'll talk about it a little when we get to the digestive system, but these are the easier organs to understand, so let's start with those. The serous fluid that's between this parietal and the visceral layer is very, very, call it viscous, but let's just say slippery. Slippery serous fluid. So what that means is, well, let's imagine there's a heart between these two lungs, is that these organs can move independently, and they do, because you're only going to be breathing maybe, I don't know, 10 or 12 times a minute at rest, and the heart might be beating 60 times per minute. So they're not in sync at all, the heart and the lungs. But this slippery sacs around them allow for really smooth, easy movement, and it reduces friction between organs. So these sacs have a really important function. If nothing else, they allow each organ to move independently and slip past each other with minimal amount of friction. Okay. Oh, I'm going to leave this mess. This is a good place to stop. So we've done basic things around the heart, and now we'll look at the heart itself.